up to the 10th.
Sure. Thank you. Okay, good morning. Today is Friday, February 9th, 2024. It's 8:40 a.m. And it's a meeting in Senate Natural Resources Energy. Continuing our work on S213, map related to regulation of wetlands, river, border development, and dam safety. Today's mission is to do a walkthrough and start to see if we can reconcile really four different major tasks that are laid out in the river corridors, floodplains, wetlands and dams, and sequence them and phase them in a way that is going to make that sense. So with that, Mr. O'Grady, we can take us on a guided tour, getting everyone reacquainted with what we have.
You want this on the screen or not?
Version, as long as I have the version.
It's still 2.1.
Yeah. So, no need to do that.
Okay, fine.
Thank you.
So this is Mike O'Grady, Office of Legislative Counsel. We're going to start walking through back number 2.1 to the second Natural Resources and Energy Amendment. It's 213. Section 1 is the overarching policy section for the chapter of law related to water resources and wetlands management. On page 1, line 9, it had previously said water resources and wetlands management policy, because wetlands are water resources. I think the interested parties suggested that and wetlands be struck.
And just before, sorry, to interrupt already, since there were edits discussed yesterday afternoon, but I wasn't here to see them all, how they're captured and where they went. The people have edits, we, let's do this as live interactive discussion, so raise a hand, flag us down, and we'll kind of insert as we go. Thank you.
So the proposed changes to the policy about the protection of wetlands and their regulation based on science has not changed. That takes you to page 2.
Protected, regulated, when necessary, controlled. I know we all put it elsewhere, someplace else in the law, expanded. It was supposed to be increasing the acres of wetlands.
Oh, that's
So on page 1, line 15, so it's protected, regulated, and restored so that there's a net gain in wetlands acreage.
Oh, I should have read the rest of the sentence. If I remember that.
Page 2, section 2 is a new definition of dam removal and wetland definition for purposes of subsequent language. Section 3 is pretty much kind of a comprehensive amendment to the agency's mapping requirements. There is a date here that's addressed in the date section that the chair handed out earlier, on or before January 1, 2026. Annually thereafter, ANR to update the Vermont significant wetlands inventory maps.
sure, right. You just referenced a handout, so this is what you're referring to. So this, where does this come from? This is you?
Yeah, this was me pulling out all the tasks that were listed, and I used Secretary Moore's version, so the date.
To the farm, nice.
Yeah, sure. They never go wrong. Right.
And all of these dates align with what we are changing with them.
No, these dates go when Secretary Moore came in, she laid out a different plan. And I used that document to cut and paste from just to get all the tasks out. It's easier to see them all, because I was feeling like it's so hard to see what's going on over 50 pages, so.
So this is your recommended.
No recommendation, just like it's a way, I could have scripted the dates off. But I left them so that we would see. What the secretary proposed, then I'm figuring we're totally up for discussion today. What are the,
So these are what the secretary proposed.
yes, and the tasks are pretty much the way the secretary laid them out.
Okay, and
Really, it's like a bundle of tasks, and what I'm hoping we do is we sort them into a sequence. Some may be. Maybe more than, some may overlap, but that will work our way all the way through the tasks. And then arrange them into a timeline. And what the best timeline is, there's, I think, really looking to finish by the time these are.
okay, my only point that I would make is I'm on the sooner bus
The
than
sooner
the
bus.
later bus.
Okay.
And besides that, I have no year to year
Okay,
preferences.
okay.
So page 2, section 3, revision to the mapping. The dates are in this are consistent with what A&R has proposed to do on a report January 1, 2026. An update to the Vermont Significant Wetlands Inventory. And then annual update thereafter with all of the geodata portal. I don't think the agency's proposal was as specific as what is in draft 2.1. Referencing integration, georeference, shape files, etc. But that is pretty consistent with some of the language you have seen before. On page 3.
So can I pause on that one? So I want to make sure our language is more durable with like how we do it by snap. Do we need changes to be more general or add a phrase about the general process?
This is Hannah Smith for the record with the Agency of Natural Resources. There were two differences in what the agency had proposed from what appears here. The first one is in on line 10, where it says and annually thereafter. We had proposed at least annually thereafter because the agency often updates the maps throughout the year. And we want to maintain that flexibility. The other change is that the agency had not included reference to the advisory layer. The advisory layer is. The agency, as we have better mapping tools, is trying to phase that advisory layer out. And provide more comprehensive updates to the VSWI itself.
Yep.
So. I know this line by line editing is difficult, but ours had just read. It had ended on line 11, since it ended, shall update the VSWI maps, period. It did not include that second clause about advisory mapping layers.
And a little challenge finding because I
It's-
printed my copy out when I get it. Yeah, but mine doesn't have the line numbers.
It's like 3 or 4 lines after section 3. It's January, or no, it's probably like 6 months. Down from inventory maps. The wetlands advisory map layers, that's what you're referring to, right? Yeah, we want to strike that up until.
After geodata for period.
Okay, everyone fine with that, okay?
Yeah, this is Karina Daly, with VNRT, and I support those changes.
Could I ask the agency about the last sentence on page 2?
Sure.
That is not in the agency's proposed language.
It is not.
Here you do not recommending it.
We are not recommending that last sentence either.
So that's the question for you all. Do you want the advisory layer, since the advisory level layer is going away? Okay,
I think that it is going to be phased out. Yes, that's.
so should that be removed as well?
This is a sentence that begins the wetland advisory layer shall include integration.
Yep.
So what's odd, I mean, I'm. I don't think there's any disagreement about trying to have good maps and this language has always concerned me a little. It's so specific that it feels a little odd for statute because someone gets new software and we don't call them the same thing anymore.
The wetlands program includes all data collected through either the wetland determination process, the permitting process, or on the ground mapping that it does. And that would be included in the update to the VSWI. So the agency would put forward that this specific language regarding the advisory layer is not necessary. We are including data that reflect in the updates to the VSWI.
Question, Hannah, this is Karina again. Would it make sense to add the additional town specific inventories to not the advisory layer, but to the Vermont significant wetlands, just to spell that out?
I think that I would want to double check with my client, but I don't see them as a causing a problem or conflicting.
That would be my recommendation.
Pull the reference up, but we didn't above. That makes sense to you, Mr. Ray?
So you want to integrate it into the inventory.
Correct. Into the VSWI update.
Great, thank you.
Um,
And sorry, and before the last sentence, too, we had marked up. Once off the very last sentence, in that section. Once all practical basins are mapped, agencies shall evaluate any practical basin. Updates on advisory cycle, you had I don't mark that there was an ANRC that changed for that phrase.
This language, as it currently appears in the bill, is the agency's.
yeah, we'll take some photos.
Okay, got it.
I believe Senator McCormick had just added, evaluate the need and update if necessary. That additional language, you had recommended that language just because we may evaluate the need, but then not update.
Okay.
I thought was a good point.
That okay. Evaluate the need and update. Got it.
Okay. Section 4 is the policy of net gain on wetlands. On for July 1, 2025. A&R amends the rules to clarify the goal of wetlands regulations and net gain of wetlands. On Senator Bray's timeline handout, that date for rulemaking would be 2026.
Oh,
Yeah, and
oh, okay, for the web.
and actually, I don't have any marks for us discussing it one way or the other, that I pulled that off the secretary's list. Are you fine with this version, or the default is the secretary's schedule? Or
I think that the agency maintains firmly that the rule should not be updated for the language in 918. I don't have a line by my head on that.
So section, so this would be line 12, page 3, it's, they're fine with 2025 versus 2026.
No, they don't want this section at all.
They don't want the section at all, and then if, let's say so they have no preference. Or if you were to have to do it,
I think, you know, hypothetically, this rulemaking deadline is not. It could be achieved. The deadline itself, yes, it's really the substance.
I understand, that makes sense, okay.
So I don't really have anything more helpful to offer.
No, that is helpful.
so for the advocating for rulemaking of it, you remind the committee of why you're recommending rulemaking when the agency is feeling that their current rule is adequate.
Say that again, Senator Bryson.
As I understand it, agency is saying they think the current rule adequate. You're suggesting rulemaking, and as you could reiterate your
Why?
rationale for rules. I know that Well, I think it's because you want to fold in the policy position that relates to a net gain.
Correct, we want to codify in statute and rulemaking that there is a net gain policy for the state of Vermont, the 2-to-1 ratio.
And this section is how that would actually happen.
And we prefer the July 1st, 2025.
So,
But you have 2026 in your.
yeah, so I'm gonna switch it from this handout. And, so if you understand that desire to codify a policy of the section B in there.
Mr. Chair, before we move on to section B, I have a note here under the developed wetlands conversation. I don't know where we wrap this would be within section A. I didn't know where we landed on that, and I think it has implications for other parts of the.
I know what the wetlands are, but I don't know what the issue is.
We were,
I have it, we were gonna put impacted wetlands, is that?
Well, I have a note on the word development.
Right, the word development,
Yeah.
yes, yeah,
Or developed?
yeah, all right, so, right.
And you just can see.
Like, they don't use the word development in the wetland rules. Sabrina, what were you gonna use?
impact, we have agreed upon impact. And in that same, or the next sentence, we want to clarify that sentence to make sure that it clearly demonstrates that it's permitted activity, like 5,000 square feet of impact to the wetland, not the size of the wetland itself.
Which sentence are you talking about? Are you talking about?
When permitted activity within a wetland that is larger than 5,000 square feet, there was a little bit of confusion there whether it was the size of the wetland.
Wetland or in.
Right.
To it.
So we need to clarify that sentence.
Do you want to clarify it?
It's impacted, right?
When wetland impacts larger than 5,000 square feet will cause adverse impact. Will cause adverse effect.
So now we are on draft 2.1, one in 9 months in, down. Draft 2.1, and doing a reading. And Mark, thank you.
So on page 4,
I'm sorry, that same thing comes up later, right?
well, I'm gonna have to change development to impacted or conforming change elsewhere.
Right, but I'm seeing the sentence right after where we edited the word development, that's 5,000. And then 3/4 of the page later, in sub C, 5,000 comes up again. That's where I had originally marked impact, so in 2 instances. For the first. Commission 3. Right, so I think it's the same concept, I'm not sure. Want to misread that same issue, correct? For both 5,000,
Yeah.
okay?
But before, on page 4, lines 1 through 11, this is basically the 2-to-1 restoration requirement. When there is an impact in a wetland, when that impact is greater than 5,000, is that how it's gonna work now?
Correct.
Then there's going to be a 2-to-1 restoration requirement. All right.
Yeah.
I think there's one more date, page 4, line 19. So this is where the net gain rule will be incorporated into the existing general permits and requirements. So my concern there is just Elkhart, honestly.
And you mean it's July 1 for finishing and July 1.
Right, and then there's the effective date period once you, Elkhart approves.
How much of a lag time would you?
It's like 45 days. I might give them like maybe 2 months for the limiting
Number
deadline.
one.
Yeah,
Instead of July 1st.
yeah.
I support that change.
Okay, great.
Uh, Page 5, this is really just implementing the 2-to-1. And the factors that are going to be addressed. I don't know if I have any markup notes for that.
The only note I have in that section was that we're talking and well, around there.
Okay.
But did we make that change already or?
Yeah. The number's been made smaller, so the area's been made larger.
Yes.
I can think of it.
It's like pages.
Dedications. There you go. I knew you. Luckily, you didn't go to like cosines or.
Good as June.
So on page, that takes you to page 6, line E. These are the reports. The reports are a little bit different from what was in the bills introduced. There had been one report, now there are 2. The first is an annual report on annual losses and gains of significant wetlands in the state. It includes all of that information that's just the beginning on page 6, line 14. Goes up to page 7, line 10. Subdivision 5 and subdivision 3 are duplicative, so one of them can be removed for 5.
And then.
Then you come to page 7, line 11. This is the every 5 years report. There's a comprehensive report on the status of wetlands in the state. It includes trends, the results of the mapping plus project. It includes relevant updates related to wetlands. And then additional data related, so.
Let me pause and add to everyone in this. So. I don't know if you have any concerns about that one or.
No, the agency is, it is agreed to the city party.
Hopefully it's similar to what you're. Holding.
The 5-year comprehensive report would be different, it would be new, but it's data that could be compatible with the agency.
Okay.
So moving on page E, this section 5, this is just a conforming amendment to a specific enforcement provision. Intended to say chapter 47 related to water resources protection.
I missed this one bit on page 7, we struck out section 5, is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay.
The department of redundancy department class. Right.
Sorry, go ahead.
So page 8, section 5 is a couple of years ago, you added wetlands into what is protected by the state's water quality standards and water quality laws, discharges, etc. And so this is a specific enforcement provision in that chapter, and this is just referencing the protection of wetlands. It's just a good conforming amendment. Page 9, line 18, section 6, this is the appropriations for wetlands program. 500,000 for mapping, 500,000 for staff. I think you all know that as soon as this goes to appropriations, they'll strip this section out. One of the things that you might want to think about doing is identifying how many positions you want at A&R to be created with the 500,000, because that's what appropriations will do. Is Senator McCormick knows you have to create the positions and then fund. So this language doesn't create the position, you can just give money for the fund.
Looking through Secretary Moore's presentation, I think there was. Page 16 of it, there's a chart. Into wetlands, as drafted. 5 that's still the department assessment of what would be required,
There was a different number if the rule revision went into effect versus just the additional reporting requirements. I'm not exactly sure what 5 FTEs, if that included the additional permitting and compensation, monitoring requirements in 918. But 5 sounds correct, if that was the presentation.
If you could double check, like we were removing wetland section as amended.
Yes.
Revised number, I'm gonna write 5 FTEs in the margin of my copy, we have something to come back to beginning next week.
I'll write it in,
Yeah.
and then if you want to change it,
Right.
whatever you want to change it.
And Karina Daly, just for the record, we support adding language to support this specifically staff versus the financial allotment. And I will just note that the 500,000 that was separated for mapping, since this language was written, that funding has been received, so we would be flexible of, having that go to staffing for mapping or an additional staff, so however that makes the most sense.
So you don't need the 500,000 for mapping?
I think we need 500,000 for someone to maintain the mapping as we've asked. But that might be a staff or not, the mapping itself, so correct, the mapping piece. There has been funding for the National Wetlands Inventory mapping for the whole state at this point in time.
I would then suggest for 5 positions that you bump it to 750,000. And then appropriations
150 each.
Right,
So we
can pull it down.
okay. Let's do that. All right. Then 7. So everything, that's the end of wetlands.
Yeah, move wetlands.
Any other notes on wetlands? So I'm looking back at the shorthand for 2027 implementation. I don't know exactly what that refers to.
When you remember you changed that September date?
Yeah.
where That's really when it will be implemented,
Oh, I see, okay.
when it has to start to be incorporated within.
Right, that's actually a 2025 date. Okay, thank you.
Moving on page 10 in section 7, this is where you're getting into development and river corridors and what is going to be required. I think you have 2. Honestly, you probably have 3 different proposals on the table right now. What is in 213, what I think it was Lauren's language that was proposed about having a study committee set up how there's going to be statewide regulation of NFIP within the flood hazard areas. He wants going forward with regulation of development in the river corridors. And then you have the agency's proposal, which is not the same. So there's 3 different proposals on the table right now.
So if I were to try to, so this is a question to the committee, I don't know, but my sense is that we ended up choosing, when things were, there's only so much resource, so we're trying to manage the resource and the timeline by saying, let's do river corridors first, because it's the source of 80% of damage and only 10% of the towns, managing that space. And then we will in a study group deal with the base in the floodplain and how municipal bylaws, it's like model bylaws. One of them. Okay. So anyone on a different position than that, you know, that's contrary to where the agency's recommendation, but if that was the rationale, greatest damage, least regulated, there's the greatest upside by going there first.
Let's see.
Right.
So the statewide, just minimum standard piece is in here as well, and they were in favor, but the agency was in favor of that. So just understand, this is going above and beyond that.
So this ends up taking that work, Ms. Oates, you're really well, we talked about this and then you wrote it, so. Let me make sure, keep the details right, that's the broader conversation in the floodplain, it's moved into a. Senate group. And that's the first, like. Rulemaking program pass focuses on the river corridor. It would be nice. I don't know that, to what degree you need to get river corridors squared away before then you start looking more broadly at floodplains. I don't fully understand the relationship between those two, if you could do them at the same time, theoretically, if you had the resource, or if you need to sequence them. Good notice.
Lauren Oates, Nature Conservancy, for the record, a few friendly amendments. First, going back to Mr. Brady's comment, there are several proposals on the table, if that's true. The language that I proposed last week, earlier this week, in committee regarding the study committee for state administration of the National Flood Insurance Program. That acknowledges both that it is a 20% problem for Vermont and not the 80% problem for river corridors, and that it is actually a much more bureaucratic, it necessarily needs to involve FEMA, and therefore there needs to be more consideration of what a state administered program might look like. That is also different from the agency's proposal, which recommends creating a statewide NFIP minimum standard, which would still need to be adopted by those towns that currently have enrolled in the NFIP to meet that minimum standard and conform to it. I'm relatively ambivalent on that going forward now, or that being folded into the broader NFIP study committee. I do think that as I understand it from some of the testimony from the regional planning commissions and the League of Cities and Towns, that there might be some concern or consternation about a higher standard needing to be adopted by towns. So I would, from my perspective, the minimum standard seems fine. But the other folks that have testified in the bill might recommend that that be pulled into a broader NFIP study committee.
Well, one of the things in the study committee language, they're very brief in terms of what they're taking on. So, for instance, it would seem like it would be helpful to take that specific path to evaluate the utility of moving to a statewide minimum standard. And
Right, but the two are still separate. So one, the minimum standard is still towns, you're on the hook for administering NFIP. The study language I proposed is saying, what might a state administered NFIP look like?
so,
Thank you. One possibility is we could do both simultaneously, and so I was just sort of like just hearing this, like, does it make sense to roll the minimum standard into the study committee? Maybe, but I also think you could establish the standard, but the point of the study committee is like, what is it, like, how would you transition the authority transitioning? And that feels separate than just saying you need to build 3 feet versus 1 foot, you know, whatever it is, right? So I would be fine with doing both. Because it seems like they have.
what's the term?
Sarah Watson, I clearly had the same, we had the same coffee this morning. So I would like to have the minimum standard, and I do understand that we have heard that that would be potentially something that towns would not be cheering to support, but what I feel like I've heard from the agency was that it would open them up to allow more technical assistance for the towns. And I do think that that ability is worthwhile.
Is a minimum standard a should or a shall?
I think it's shout. It's a shout.
It says it will be
I
required.
think it's a
No,
shall.
it
or
is a shout.
It's
It
a
might not
shall.
be shall, but it is required, I
It
think.
says,
What's the difference?
I'll read you the language, you can determine. The secretary shall adopt rules that establish a set of flood hazard area standards required to be adopted and administered by all municipalities enrolled in the National Flood Insurance Program.
The secretary does it, so when the Conservation Law Foundation shows up.
That's when FEMA would show up and say, your town is non-compliant with the minimum standard. And your
You bet
town,
it is.
Non-compliant, that's the way we like it.
well, and then the impact would be they could remove the status of NFIP, and so everybody in that municipality that has flood insurance would lose access to flood insurance.
So actually they tier it. If you're not in compliance originally, then everybody's insurance rates go up. For a defined period of time. So that then inspires your municipality because your constituents are like screaming at them about their insurance rates going up.
Screaming,
The town.
for the towns. Sounds pretty good at reflecting that stuff upwards. Who came up with this, maybe thing that we're screaming at you about, but
That's FEMA.
Hard to yell at FEMA.
I don't know if they hear us.
Senator Watson,
Forgot what was.
since the agency was proposed
You're gonna agree with me, I remember.
the rule. Go ahead.
No, just that, so, and the same theme of like. Ways that it could be beneficial is that it would make it easier for the. For, A&R to provide that. To, I mean, you know, they don't have to look up what the standards are for every individual school.
Yeah.
And as long as we are also allowing municipalities to go beyond that, because there were some that had adopted higher standards, and I should have probably looked at the language to see if that is allowable, but as long as that's baked in, that you can go above that. Yes.
Okay. So you want, excuse me, you want both the minimum standard and stuff.
Right that way, so, right, let's do the minimum standards, and then statewide management of it as a question. Or
The transition.
the possible transition for a study.
so. This assumes that the appropriation would be there to enforce and make happen what we're trying to create step by step behaviors.
Yeah, yes, I mean, I'm guessing there's resources, you know, look back at the secretary's proposal, if I can see if I can tease out the piece that's related to river corridors, yes, it lists. Sorry, the flood hazard areas. Two FTEs are listed as necessary for implementation of the statewide flood hazard area minimum standard. Ms. Smith, can you remind us if you know what the two FTEs are, or what they're doing? Developing that standard, doing the outreach.
Yes, this is Hannah Smith for the record. The two FTEs proposed to assist with the adoption of a minimum flood hazard area rule. And then also assist with education and outreach associated with the towns folding those requirements into their bylaws and ordinances.
And that's a role you already played. Who's Pfeiffer? I mean, not
Yes,
to a
so-
standard, but. The town by town, 274 entities you're out there helping them figure it out.
Correct, the floodplain managers at DEC do that outreach currently. The additional FTEs would be to allow for the expansion of the program, to have a rule that was actually implementable across the state.
So we need to attach unappropriation to that section.
But you have potentially one other issue that you need to talk about that might impact the appropriation. And that's the mapping. If you look at A&R's, I don't have the PowerPoint presentation, I have language. That there was going to be a process for amending the statewide river corridor base map. To identify areas within designated centers suitable for infill and redevelopment. And that is the mapping that is referred to on the various timelines that you see.
Okay,
And there's no reference to infill in the bill that you have in front of you.
okay. So I had, thank you for bringing that up. I had sort of filed that mapping task away as part of the river corridor work. But is it also necessary to have a well-drawn floodplain map, flood hazard area map?
The. No, they're two separate mapping efforts. The infill mapping is tied to the phase-in of river corridor regulation, so separate from and the agency did propose 2 FTEs for phase-in of river corridor regulation, in addition to the 2 FTEs for implementation of the flood hazard area rule.
So is that clarify for,
It clarifies what you would need for the river corridors. I don't think you've actually addressed what you're going to do in the corridors yet.
no, so I was thinking we would get to that next, but we would try to square away, statewide minimum flood hazard area.
Yeah.
5 of them.
So for flood hazards, there's 3 markups. You want the minimum standard based on the language that A&R provided. You want the study committee based on what Lauren and what Lauren provided. And then you have 2 FTE positions to implement the minimum flood hazard area rule and assist municipalities in the adoption of that standard.
Yes.
Mhm.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
You still really haven't moved off of page 11.
Did we correct the document on page 10 though? I still haven't.
Well, that's part of what. At the bottom of page 11. On before January 1, 2026, A&R shall adopt rules that establish requirements. For issuing and enforcing permits for development within a flood hazard area or map river corridor of the state. But then you go on to. Oh, where is it? It's not required.
The definition you mean?
No, it's on page 14. Beginning July 1, 2026, a person shall not commence or conduct development of a flood hazard area or map river corridor without a permit issued by the secretary. So that is,
And what's?
that's the state system, and you've already said for flood hazard areas, you're gonna do a study committee. And then the question is are you going to do a state permitting system for river corridors? And it won't matter, the municipality has adopted a bylaw for river corridors, since the agency is just going to require a permit for development in the.
Right, so our conversation is not tracking with the bill right now.
Yeah.
The next thing the bill was definitions and then it went into river corridors, but yeah, it's on the river corridor side. And yes, proceed with the any additional mapping, and I don't know if there's a implementation is requires a additional rulemaking, or the existing recorder rules are sufficient.
So the existing river corridor rules only apply to development that's exempt from municipal regulation. There's only 5 things that are listed. So this would apply to every else.
So this feels right for rulemaking.
They're gonna need a general permit that's significant. Then they need a rule or inform the general permit.
So that's. I would say, anyone say, you disagree with that? Whatever task to be done in order to get river corridor management, statewide. So we have, I don't know what additional mapping takes place from what Mr. Evans said. It sounded like the mapping piece was premature, getting some regular updates, but I don't know if there was any new mapping task that is entailed if we do river corridors.
I think that's the infill development.
Okay, thank you.
And that's what Rob was saying, is actually they done the mapping of the river corridors, and they haven't mapped. Is the infill development where
Right,
these new regulated activities could actually occur.
right. So there's that, how is it gonna connect? Thank you. I've lost track of that piece. So that is probably part of the rule, it's all the reason for the rulemaking, but you need the math to support that rulemaking. And so I'd like to pause and figure out what's the rulemaking. The mapping resources and the rulemaking resource for river corridors.
So for the mapping, the language that. I'm not sure who this was, I think it was maybe you. And it says that the rulemaking shall set forth the process for amending statewide river corridor base map. To identify areas within designated centers suitable for infill and redevelopment.
Yeah. That
will not cause or contribute to increases in fluvial erosion. So that is part of the rulemaking, and then. I think the bill itself has rulemaking. And so you'll have 2 different versions. Well, it'll be all incorporated in the same. It will establish. Page 12. Line 18, establish the requirements and processes. That's the delegation. And then on page 11, about rules that establish requirements for issuing and enforcing permits for development. So you have a rulemaking to establish. To identify areas. For infill, then you have a rulemaking for. Establishing requirements for issuing and enforcing permits for development. And then you have a rulemaking, part of the rulemaking. It's about delegation of the permitting for river corridors to municipalities.
So, all those things make sense as delegating the authority. I thought that one of the points of moving to that river corridor management was going to stay a state permit as opposed to delegating that. So let me check in proposers. But I didn't, so have I lost a detail in this that, yes, once we had finished our river corridor mapping, the infill, the rule that the enforcement would not stay with the state, but could be delegated to a municipality that accepted them?
That's currently in there. I think that. I don't know if the agency has a strong opinion about that, frankly.
Is there a precedent to follow here. Like that, yes, if the town wants to meet a rule, it can. Take over management of the rule, implementation of the rule.
Yes, waste, septic systems, wells. In Colchester and Charlotte are delegated that. And then, like shorelands, I think Burlington's the only one that's been delegated that. You have to meet a minimum standard.
Yeah.
Post that standard to the agency, and they have to approve, and then you have to. You basically need to allow yourself to be reviewed and monitored and inspected by the agency to see if you're appropriately.
Is there, since, I can imagine septic is really different and shoreline, they're discrete. Things as opposed to a river corridor, which. Have a connected system. I don't know if we lose any value by saying you can delegate to the local level and. Lose a single entity, a single agency overlooking the whole river corridor. I don't know if there's a value add staying with the state alone. It's a question.
Presumably, the municipality would have to demonstrate that they have the resources and the technical expertise to actually do the program. It would be a relatively high bar.
Yeah.
But if, I think that we do have these other examples where municipalities can be delegated authority to implement programs where it makes sense to have that permitting take place on a local level.
Right, so let's keep it that it can be delegated.
And you still have the issue of what is development.
Yes, I'm still on that page, section 7.
So for purposes of flood hazard area, you need to keep it at the. At the definition of FEMA, because if you don't, then. As we discussed earlier, you potentially lose eligibility. But you don't need to keep it. At the FEMA standard in the river corridor. And if you. I mean, it really comes down to what does this new permit mean? Are you taking away the zoning authority of a municipality to regulate for development? Do you want to take away their ability to regulate shorelands on rivers because they have that authority right now? I don't, there are those kinds of questions. Or is this just the state? It's a kind of like the way the river corridor permit is now. It's just a yes, no. Yes, you can do it. No, you can't. And that's all it is. And then the municipality. Well, that's not how it works with the current. The municipality can't regulate those uses under the current law. But then the municipality would regulate development as it does otherwise. So you'd be adding another permit or another process.
So I'm gonna look back to the proposers of the amendment to see if you had a vision of this, how this would be implemented on Mr. Grady's pointing out. Anyone want to weigh in?
This is Laura Notes for the record. I was trying to follow that as best I could. Generally, the highest level. The proposal in draft 2.1 is to expand the existing flood hazard area river corridor approval to allow for expanded jurisdiction within DEC Rivers program over the mapped river corridor in the state. That would mean that development as defined currently in this draft would be at the purview of DEC Rivers staff to say yes or no, informed again by that infill mapping process in section 4 of the rulemaking. Yes, no, or yes in that space because the map said we couldn't.
Okay.
Via a permit.
But would a municipality also have the authority to require a permit?
An additional permit for the same thing.
Yes.
I would think that the state's permit would supersede that, so you wouldn't have duplicative permits.
So in order to comply with like the home act. About. What size and type and location of development. I don't expect anywhere willing to address that. But municipal zoning bylaw will. So. I don't know the answer to this. This is your proposal, so how does this work?
And so I'm familiar with the Home Act admittedly, so I would need to look at that back to as soon as possible.
Or are you just taking away home act authority from municipalities in the map river corridor and our rule is now gonna have to comply with home act?
Yes, that sounds right.
Yeah,
But for what definition of development, because they're not the same definitions of development for home act versus what's in the bill right now.
I can look at the definition of the development and Home Act right now. Helpful. Once you have it, it's stagnant.
I'm not totally, I don't have a formulated opinion on this section because I'm not sure what the proposals are and in fact what they do. So I'm wondering if perhaps we could put a pin in this section and maybe think further, or are you, I'm trying to
I
understand
think
what.
we're close to being able to have it, to make a decision for next draft.
Okay,
And that once it's clarified next draft, we'll have so many other things. Nailed down, that it'll be a lot clearer to see what the remaining decision points are.
my only value statement on this is I was concerned about the definition of development, which seems to be focused on this. Because we had some kind of anecdotal conversations about if you're building a raised bed. You know, or you're putting up hoop houses, that, I wanna understand what actually
Right.
is within that definition based on the terms. And my preference would not be to enter us into that level of micromanaging in those areas.
Right.
But I don't know where that line is, and I don't even know where that line is for myself, so.
So this is how land development is defined for purposes of zoning bylaws, which now have to comply with the home act. It's the division of a parcel into two or more parcels, comma. The construction, reconstruction, conversion, structural alteration, relocation, or enlargement of any building or other structure. Comma, or any mining, excavation, or landfill, comma. And any change in the use of any building or other structure or land or extension of use of. Period. So that overlaps with the definition of development that FEMA uses. But it is both narrower and to an extent broader. Than. So. The FEMA development is not about like extension of use of land.
What is the extension of use of land mean?
It's basically change of use.
Change of use. What would be an example? Like,
Pardon?
what would be, I'm just wanna make sure I have the right picture. What would be example? What's an example or two of change of use, but
So.
residential to commercial?
For example, the river corridor rule doesn't regulate repair. Renovation, et cetera. It doesn't address the use of the property. Whereas zoning bylaws address use of the property. Any alteration, restoration, et cetera, under the river corridor rule only gets triggered if you do something that 50% of the value of the property. And then, but if you're doing something that's. I mean, anybody that does a renovation in the town with zoning has to go and get the big Z to put on their house, right? I mean. I don't know if you're gonna need the big Z underneath the river corridor rule. But you're gonna need it under the municipal bylaw. So. don't know how to reconcile, I'm just raising these questions,
Yeah.
I don't have answers for it, I'm just like. This is an issue I see, I don't know how you wanna reconcile.
Right. So I think in order to let us take a tentative position, whatever, and move on and then come back and reconsider it. I would propose that we stick with the FEMA definition we have and then explore the implications of sticking with it. I think, like the raised bed threshold that that could be problematic, right? It seems like a very fine trigger that may not seem sensible. Senator Watts.
Thank you. Can the level of sensitivity be? I'm not sure what the right word is for like. The opposite of like a fine cone, right? That would, trigger like, be triggered by the raised beds. Can it be broadened or things be exempted by virtue of rulemaking?
If the impact is less than X,
Right.
then you're about.
Well, the agency. This is just my intuition or understanding. They're not gonna be able to do this program without a significant general permit. That's gonna have a lot of non-reporting provisions in it.
Non-reporting.
But there's no way that they're gonna be like. You need an individual permit to stack your hay bales.
Yeah,
So they're gonna have to have a general permit.
so is that offer the kind of discretion Senator Watts is talking about? That you would set up conditions that would trigger the individual permit and post operating in the general.
Right, I mean, I. One of the things that's exempt from municipal regulation right now are state facilities and construction. One of the things that the existing river corridor rule exempts from regulation is highway infrastructure. Right, so they can put an exemption. And I think they probably would put that exemption in because FEMA is gonna accept federal highway management requirements for purposes of, because they kind of overlap. So you're gonna have to, you don't have that issue in the river corridor, so they'll be able to issue exemptions. AOT will be like, yeah, first in line. You're gonna give us an exemption and everything with your health.
I feel that who's gonna be second, okay, so,
The utilities
yeah.
will be set.
Senator Watson?
Thank you. Well, I'm wondering if it is useful for process of rulemaking to like. For informing this, if it makes sense for us to include a section on that, like we would intend to have a non-reporting section in it. May include blah, 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 so that. And I'm also, I'm anticipating selling this to my colleagues, right? So like, how do we communicate that, like, these are things that are not triggers?
So I would say in the rulemaking, you give them the ability to have exemptions from the permit requirement and or the requirements for complying but not reporting. The question would be, sometimes you require the rule to include the general permit, so the general permit has to be issued under the APA. That's not that common. Most of the time, you just tell the agency to adopt the rule, and then you give them general permit authority, and they issue the general permit on their own.
You have this. This is a new proposal, but. Can you offer agency feedback as to a preferred way of addressing this question?
Yes, the agency would like an extended timeline to complete the infill mapping,
Yeah,
to conduct outreach, which would explore this question in particular, how many communities are gonna be directly impacted by the adoption of this rule?
Yeah.
And how can regulation be implemented in a way that doesn't create takings?
Yeah,
Then the agency would ask that we be given authority to adopt a general permit and not through the rulemaking process.
So let's draft that way. And, I don't know if, we lay out in the intent relating to that rulemaking, something along the lines of establishing thresholds. You can imagine an extended pre-rulemaking that you would have plenty of comments or something. Yes. Then I would ask you to adjust dates for that process. If you would recommend the committee and then we could.
Well, your dates,
Yeah.
I don't know where you got your dates from, but
I think
they're. They have until 2026 to do the infill mapping.
Yeah,
They have until 28 to do education and outreach. They have until 29 to finish the rulemaking. And then they have until 2030 for an expanded permitting program.
I'll read it. Yeah. And those came from the secretary's proposal on this tab. Senator Monson.
Thank you. Maybe I'm wrong about this. My understanding is that the dates that are in here do not match up with the dates that are on here.
That's correct.
Okay. Well, so just on that note, I like the idea of longer pre-rulemaking, that makes sense. I would, Senator McCormick had this idea, yesterday, maybe a couple days ago, about that it makes some sense to have overlap between the education and outreach and the mapping portions. I thought that was good, my interest is to also like get this done as fast as we can, realistically. So just looking at opportunities to, combine things or like what makes sense to have overlap on this timeline. There's a case that was made to say that mapping ought to be done before education starts. But I do think that there's gonna need to be, some give and take on that. I think they're coming with a strong draft. But letting it be malleable still at that point. So, one of the things that I would like, so one comment, one question, wondering about possibility of moving up the education and outreach portion to overlap with the mapping 25 to 27. And then wondering as to, I'm less familiar, thank you, with the rulemaking process. So I don't know how much needs to be done before the rulemaking can start. I don't know why.
How much mapping plus education.
Right, or is it the kind of thing where rulemaking could happen, could at least start in the absence of the mapping? So there's enough to do that you don't necessarily need the maps to.
I think you need to figure out how you're gonna do the mapping or direct the mapping, because in A&R's language. It would be under rulemaking that they would set forth a process for amending the river corridor base map to identify infill. So they'd have to go to rulemaking before they did the mapping. Underneath that proposal.
So you,
Or you just pull that mapping directive out of rulemaking. And just tell them to update their maps to identify. Areas within designated centers, so.
And I think our discussion has been that process needs to engage the municipalities because it has such, it's so consequential for them.
It could be pulled out of the rulemaking.
You wouldn't care if it's pulled out of rulemaking?
I think I need to see one, but
For next draft.
yeah, it doesn't. I think that proposal included it as part of the flood hazard area rulemaking. I'm not,
Yeah, you're right.
okay, so if this were a separate track that was moving forward on its own timeline, I don't think it would be necessary for that to be part of the flood hazard area.
So this proposal about this timeline had a rule, right, because it, I mean, it says here like amend the flood hazard area and river corridor rule, so that was really a combination. Rulemaking process, right?
That was the initial, that was 213 as introduced.
Oh, okay.
That was pushing a full state regulatory program, regulatory authority over both of those.
So it's like pulling the flood hazard area out of that process, because it's studied, do you see it as possible that we could move up the rulemaking to happen simultaneously with some of these other aspects?
I would think that what the committee is asking right now, based on what I understand, is that we do a state minimum flood hazard area rulemaking and a river corridor rulemaking. Doing those simultaneously would be very, very challenging. But this is,
Oh,
Up to the
so,
committee.
sorry, no, thank you, so this is, and because we have this proposal in here about. And also please move forward with a statewide
Right.
minimum.
And that has to meet FEMA standards, and it has to specifically meet those standards.
Okay. So,
This doesn't.
okay, so you all would have more capacity if we rolled in the statewide minimum together with the study, which would have more of its own process and timeline and
yes, what the agency had proposed was an initial flood hazard area minimum standard adopted through rule and an extended timeline to complete the infill mapping and to do outreach and adopt a river corridor regulation.
so. Because the river corridors is like the 80% problem, my gut would be to, and I realize this is going back to what I said previously, but particularly for capacity, I might suggest that we roll the minimum standard statewide into the study, delay that timeline and allow the rulemaking to be a little faster for specifically the river corridor part. You don't have to have a comment, right? Okay. I'm just saying, this is what seems, if I had to prioritize.
Well, I think that's why
That would
we
be
had
better.
it, we were talking about having a study was to not have too many things happening.
Yes.
I think it's important to note that the municipal regulation of flood hazard areas will continue to happen in order to
Yes.
maintain FEMA or NFIP eligibility. And so the state's proposal for adopting a minimum standard was to increase our ability to assist with that regulation. The river corridor piece, from the agency's perspective, needs a longer rollout time because it would be a new statewide regulation that theoretically took jurisdiction over many thousands of miles of shoreline.
Sorry, that's so good. And so do you think that as long as we were just focusing on the river corridors, coming back to this question, like, does it make sense to at least even have pre-rulemaking or to some aspect of it getting going sooner than 2028? Or to say like, can it overlap with the education and outreach or the mapping aspect?
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
that initial timeline in terms of pre-rulemaking and
That can be moved up.
Yeah.
Okay, great, thank you, awesome.
Okay, so, but we need to translate that back into traffic.
So.
Well. It's awkward that I don't wanna be respectful of ANR. Resources and the demands we're proposing to put on. The department, it is. It's like Sophie's choice here or something, it's like we have an opportunity to do something meaningful at the flood hazard area. And we're seeing a bigger problem with the borders. If. The maybe more achievable flood hazard area minimum standard, statewide standard. We're contemplating moving it off in order to do the flood, the river corridor first, and it makes me a little concerned that. A heavier lift with greater impact is being prioritized in a way to the exclusion of. Other work that we wouldn't necessarily want to forego or delay. But, and I would say for the sake of drafting. Let's pull the. We made a decision, let's stick with it and see it in writing, which was. There's a study committee, there's also the implementation of the statewide area rulemaking. For the standard, and there's the river corridor one. I would say let's put the proposal we would most like to see forward for the next draft. And if we, or we see the bottlenecks,
I can put the proposals in, I can leave the dates question marks. And you can figure out the dates of some subsequent meeting.
I'm always wanting to put dates in because it helps us see where things are landing, but. It's a useful suggestion. Chairman McCormick.
Yeah, I know the conflict appears to have. Come apparent while I was at it. So I am gonna be. A little angle. And maybe not through.
Sure, and I think we're just trying to create a next draft, and I think the next draft is already going to be clarifying what our choices and decision points are. And the implications of them in terms of timing or resource. So let's stick with that decision we made 20 minutes ago. We go ahead
We can revisit.
with the flood hazard piece. We do the study committee on statewide implementation of it. And then we continue with the river corridor piece as we were just discussing. So I think we need a reasonable timeline for the mapping, outreach, and rulemaking sequence that happen.
Okay, so this is what I would propose. The first thing you do, you take the mapping for the infill out of the rulemaking, you just direct the agency to complete it by, I don't know, 26. That's a year and a half, then they'll have. They said that they're gonna need 2 positions for that, so do you give them the 2 positions or not?
Yes.
Okay. And then you can start the education and outreach prior to that. You can probably start the education and outreach, beginning July 2025. They shall prepare materials for the distribution, have public participation meetings with municipalities regarding the regulation and the development in river corridors.
So I'd say yes,
And
yeah.
then you collect input. In 27, they report to you what they collected. In 26, they can start a rulemaking process. And I would give them 2 years to do the rulemaking.
It sounds like it's gonna be pre-rulemaking,
Right.
rulemaking.
And you will get a report that will allow you to stop it.
Okay, that seems like a,
So let's just walk through that
Yeah.
again, so mapping. Right away. Finished by 2026. 2 FTEs. Education and outreach. Starts. 2025. Ends 2027. With a report to you. Rulemaking. Starts 2026,
2028.
that's pre-plus. And with a deadline of 2028. And then you're probably gonna want at least a 6-month period for implementation. What you also need to realize is the vested rights issue and the
What issue?
the vested rights issue. And then the push for people to develop prior to anything going into effect.
Inevitable. Inescapable. Lamentable.
What was that? Implementation.
So when people realize that there's gonna be this state permit and they realize what's gonna be in this rule, and what the permit is. They're gonna try to develop.
Oh.
prior
It's
to-
a highway, it's a highway all over here.
No.
I don't.
From Essex.
Shoreline is, well, shoreline things more like it, I mean, but.
Land
People
becomes
just-
more valuable, other land becomes less valuable, and there's a distribution of wealth amongst the owners of the land. And he or she who gets the map first. Can. Push the redevelopment, the redistribution of wealth their way. I mean, that's what it is.
Okay,
I'm also gonna give you,
we're gonna need it, and it's takings on your list with question mark.
I'm not too worried about these things.
As long as flip side of takings is giving.
I mean, takings is a site by site, acre by acre, parcel by parcel analysis. You start out with the government physically occupy the property, no. Is it deprived of all economic value? That's gonna be site by site, but probably not. And then you do a balancing test versus the governmental interest versus the investment based expectations of the owner. And it's,
Run all of that.
Yeah, that's a lot. Interesting.
and it's, people are adamant that government is taking, you know, but the courts are like, no. So it's not as common as you think it is.
It's the ultimate leverage that there's a public good that exceeds that.
Right, the legitimate state interest that's involved.
So, sorry. Is the government physically occupying? Is it
It's
deprived
deprived
of
of
all?
all economic value or benefit. And that's only been used like once or twice nationally,
Oh,
but
okay,
it's still technically a law.
okay, and what's the third one?
It's a balancing test, it's called a Penn Central test. There's 3, potentially 4. First thing you have to realize, look at is there a property interest involved? And you have to look at what the state interest is. And we go through what the investment back expectations of the owner are. And then there's the 3rd/4th, and I can't remember what that is, and then like the courts have to balance all of it.
Right.
Okay,
So
thank you.
we'll, thank you. So it feels to me like we now dispatched the river corridor and implementation piece, and flood hazard area piece. We did wetlands. And we've been going straight for
And I just,
90 minutes. What else?
I'm gonna give you some language to try to reconcile municipal land use development authority over what's gonna be the state's development authority. I don't know if it's work, but I'll talk to Alan and others and I'll give you something to look at.
So it feels to me like a after now, we have a good point to pause. Jill, what are, you with us, Val?